My 7 millisecond break is over. All right. Selection traits. What are you going to choose? What are you going to select on? Well, I would say the bread and butter of most breeding programs is pest and disease resistance. You're trying to get things that are important to your main customer, which is the farmer. And the farmer wants their crop to make it to harvest with a saleable crop, which means limiting the risks of pest and diseases. So the pest and disease resistant packages or set of genes to multiple disease problems and if possible pest problems, that is what is the bread and butter of most breeding programs. But I've already mentioned this, true resistance is yes or no. It's either resistant or not resistant. And usually that's a single gene resistance. So there is one gene in the plant and one gene in the pathogen that might cause the disease, like a fungus, and they act like a lock and key. And if the pathogen, the fungus in this example, has the proper key and it matches that gene in such a way that it can get in, the resistance doesn't work. But if the key doesn't match the lock on the plant's gene, it can't get in. So there are these molecular receptors, and it either works where it can get in or it doesn't. And it's this constant mutation, evolutionary cat and mouse game where a plant develops resistance and then the pathogen overcomes the resistance. And once it's overcome the resistance, there's a new pathotype, a new type of pathogen out there, genetically different, but very similar to the other ones. And now the plant has to evolve a new disease resistance gene. And that gene for gene interaction, as it's called in many cases, is a very, very interesting story. And as some of you are doing your research and as you're digging in for your papers, you might even think about looking up gene for gene interaction with whatever disease you're looking into for those of you who are doing a term project on a plant disease. You might find some really interesting stories that you could maybe shift the focus of what you're talking about or add an interesting paragraph to your paper to mention it, whatever you want to do. But gene for gene interaction, very fascinating stuff. Tolerance is somewhere in between. It's not resistant, it's not completely susceptible. It has the ability to inhibit the pathogen long enough and effectively enough to have a much higher chance of getting a marketable product harvested and to the customer. And those are generally multigenic. Tolerance is more complicated in how it works genetically, and it's a multiple set of genes that, in some cases, will keep the disease from getting out of hand. What about yield? That's another trait. And that I would say is always there on the back burner. And it's not always the highest yield is the best. No, there's a compromise. Now, certainly higher yield is something that most people tend to go for, but there are some serious exceptions. In this area, I would say the most common exception is the wine grape industry. If you overproduce, which is easy to do on some varieties, uh, you have too many pounds of grapes per acre, you're going to actually lose more money. You're not going to make more money because your customer not only looks at your product, but looks at your records for pounds per acre. And if you pass some certain number, the assumption is that you overcropped those grapes. You put too many pounds of grapes on the root system, and there's only so much roots per acre. And the idea is you can only get so many pounds of high quality wine grapes per acre. And if you push past that, your price goes down. You actually end up losing money. But for other things, lettuce, the more the merrier. Strawberries, the more they can produce, the happier I am if they're quality strawberries. Uniformity issues, uniformity of size. So when I've got my tomatoes, they're all the same size tomatoes on the plant. They're all mature at the same date. Heck, when I came to this valley, a lot of people would harvest a field of lettuce and then come back a couple days later, a few days later, and harvest again. They would take 2 passes. So they get everything that's ready today, and depending on how warm it was, it would be, a couple days or 5 days, whatever, later, they would come back and get all the ones that weren't ready yet. That was expensive to come through with a crew twice. They don't do that anymore. The uniformity expectations in a field of lettuce is such that you get it all once, period, and then you move on. If anything is left that might be edible, you might send what's called a gleaning crew through that will take whatever's left, and the company can get a tax write-off for sending that to food banks or something of that sort, homeless shelters, whatever. But you want everything ready at the same time. Some grains like wheat, you come through once and the entire field is ready. You don't have some of the wheat ready. Excuse me, some of the wheat ready on one day, some of it on another day. That doesn't work at all. There's a grain, you may have heard of it, quinoa, Quinoa, I believe it is. But quinoa is, or Quin, yeah, Noa, I think that's right. Fabulous grain, nutty flavor, healthy. Some people who promote quinoa are, it's like it's the magic food. Well, there's nothing magic about it. There's a lot of healthy grains, and this is just one of them. A lot of seeds and other things, millet, and I mean, there's some fabulous healthy seeds and grains out there. Problem with quinoa is there hasn't been the effort to breed it for uniformity, and so it doesn't produce as uniform a crop, and so there's challenges in terms of harvesting. Level yield curve. I talk about that with strawberries, and let me show you something here. Strawberries are an interesting type of product. So if I look at strawberries, and I've got my early season, late season, mid-season harvest. Depending on where you are on planet Earth, that might be different times of the year. But for a lot of strawberries, you have something that might look like this. And the curve will be different for different varieties. And is that a problem? No, actually, that's not a huge problem. That's just normal. That's what happens when you are harvesting your strawberries. But your customer, the grocery store chains, they don't want a whole bunch of strawberries right here and then not nearly enough over here. So there might be another variety that you might grow that might have a yield curve that looks like this. And when you look at all of the varieties that you have, what you're trying to do is trying to have a yield curve such that when you average it all out, you have a relatively flat, stable supply for your customer. There's even some strawberry varieties that will give you something that looks like this. Well, hopefully not quite like that. I'm still learning how to use this dang Wacom tablet. I'll probably never be good at it, but doesn't matter. You'll get a burst of high yield in the spring, and then it'll chill out for a little while. It'll fall off, and then you'll get another wave of strawberry production in the early fall, perhaps. And so again, you can add that to the mix and try to get a stable or level curve for your customers, with some exceptions, because depending on where you're growing, if you're growing in an area that has harvest on February 14th, not Watsonville and Salinas, but other areas, other growing areas do have the Valentine's Day strawberry market. That's a big one. Mother's Day is another big one. Um, there's a bit of a blip for uh, the holiday surrounding 4th of July. Certainly late, the uh, Christmas holidays, starting off with um, Thanksgiving. There's a little bit of a push as the demand's going way down. There's just a little blip. It's still nothing like earlier. People don't expect strawberries as much off season. Kind of like apples and bananas, people expect it 12 months a year, stable. They're always eating them. There's no up and down. There's an expectation they're always there. Strawberries, it's expanded. Instead of it just being a summer crop, we now have expanded it, but still winter strawberries are not exactly a huge thing. So you need to know that. You need to know your customers. You need to know that yield curve. You need to know that market timing. And you breed for that. You breed for the timing. Plant architecture, or the shape of the plant. You want your roses to, long stem roses, to give nice, straight, long stems. You want your strawberries to grow in a way where the strawberry plant is relatively modest size and the strawberries are easy to get at. Some strawberry plants, they look big and puffy, and that's not good. Big and puffy means the strawberries are inside, where it's more humid, cooler, wetter, and the strawberries end up getting mold on them, and the harvesting crew has to hunt around for them. And that slows them down, and they don't like slowing down. They're getting paid what's called piece rate, meaning they get paid X number of cents for every flat that they pull out of the field. And they want to be pulling in way more than minimum wage, and they want to be working at piece rate where they're making good money, and sometimes they do. And if the plant architecture isn't good, the strawberry crews are going to decide to go to another grower that has better plants. Now, you can screw that up in strawberries with too much nitrogen as well. It's not just the genetics. Adding too much nitrogen at the wrong time, and you can get the plant to go poof and just puff up with leaves. It grows extra leaves with too much nitrogen, and those extra leaves can be a problem. It happened to one of the growers I worked with in the past, and I remember we basically gave an extra stipend, an extra piece rate stipend, and I don't remember if it was based on piece rate or if it was just, here's an extra $5 an hour on top of everything else, because it was horrible. The crew had to dig through every plant trying to find the dang strawberries, and they found some of them that were not good, too many of them that were not good, more than usual, and it was costing them time and money. And we wanted to make sure that when they walked out of the field that day, at the end of the day, they made as much as they did the previous day in a better field. And I'm glad that the grower was willing to do that. I don't know if the motivation was to help the crew or to not lose the crew to somebody else, have them get pissed off and walk away. Whatever his motivation was, we made the crew happy. Lettuce, the architecture of lettuce is, a crisp head iceberg lettuce anyway, is supposed to be round and smooth. And if you have what are called ribs on the bottom, that can be a serious problem. And so ribs on the bottom can present some serious challenges for damage when you harvest it. So lettuce ribs, let me just show you what I am talking about. Probably should have pulled this up earlier, but doesn't matter. So here's a picture. You can see these are the ribs, the mid ribs. And if the mid ribs in some cases stick out, they get bruised and damaged, and it's a place to start mold. It doesn't look good. It damages in handling. It's just not good. You want those ribs to be low and tight to the head. And that can be partly genetic and partly environmental, the weather in which those plants grew. And then the cores are the stems, because lettuce is actually a rosette of leaves around a central core. And so here is the core. This is a stem attached directly to the root. And then there's whorls of leaves around the stem. And the only thing is, instead of the leaves out flat in crisp head lettuce, they curl around and form a ball. But it's no different than other types of rosettes that typically form a flat type core. Here's another core in a different type of lettuce, another core. So you can see what the core is. And if you have a high core, not sure if this will show up in this search engine or not. And I'm not seeing one here. Oh, well, doesn't matter. What happens is the core that we just looked at moments ago, the core can grow really high. And this core, instead of being down here, which this is a modest core, it's not small, but it's not huge, it's not a problem, but the core can be all the way up into here. That is a problem, because it's going to get into your chopped salad. The customer isn't going to like it because they're paying for a bunch of hard core that they're going to throw out instead of the nice leaves. And it can actually cause damage inside the head as well. As this core grows up, it might start to break these leaves and cause other problems. Quality strawberries and lettuce. You need airflow to prevent fungal diseases. So again, when I was talking about the architecture of strawberries, a nice modest sized plant not only is easier to harvest, but it keeps the disease level down by allowing airflow, not too many leaves, so air can move through. And with lettuce, you don't want the lettuce sitting right on top of the bed. It's nice if it's got a little bit where it's not touching the surface of the bed, at least not touching it thoroughly, where it's just smashed down on the bed. And some plants grow that way. We had a perfect variety, I remember, that it just sickened me to have to throw it away with the really bad heads of lettuce in my breeding program, because it was beautiful. But it grew in a way that it sat right on the bed and the bottom would start molding too often. That didn't work. But you also need to grow it spaced properly for the size of the heads. Again, airflow. Maturity date, you want things to mature and be ready for harvest on a particular date or dates. Climate adaptation, if we're talking lettuce, Yuma versus Salinas, winter versus summer, very, very different climatic conditions depending on where you are. Color, leaf shape, nutrition, flavor, on and on and on. What's important to you? What's important to your customer? And I think there's a little more focus in modern times about the consumer. Remember, the customer is the farmer when you're making seed and clonal Plant products. Who are you selling it to? The farmer who's going to plant that seed and grow it. Who's the consumer? Well, that's the person shopping at Safeway, Nob Hill, Save Mart, whatever, Food for Less. They're buying the produce to take home and eat it. And what do they want? For the longest time, for heck, a couple of generations, nobody cared what the consumer thought. They just needed a product that worked. Flavor, whatever. They just need something that will be grabbed off the shelf and stuck into the shopping cart. And now that's a little different. People are looking at flavor. People are looking at uh, the consumer's goals, nutrition, etc. So where do we get these new traits? Well, I'll tell you in a moment.